In the winter of 1943, as the Allies fought to regain momentum across Europe, far from the front lines another kind of battle was unfolding. Quiet, invisible, and fought not with rifles or tanks, but with intercepted signals and uncertain intentions. Few knew that inside a windowless basement of the OSS signals branch in London, a single transmission, barely a page of encoded numerals, would ignite one of the war's most perplexing intelligence puzzles. It arrived just after midnight on January 12, carried through a Soviet diplomatic channel the Allies believed they understood. But its structure, its cadence, and its unexplained deviations were unlike anything American or British cryptanalysts had seen from Moscow. It was as if the sender wanted it to stand out. The team on duty that night initially assumed it was an error, a routine miskey, or a scrambled GRU logistics packet. Yet the message's abrupt references, translated roughly to "the missing one" and "the corridor breach," triggered unease. The Soviets rarely deviated from their rigid cipher practices, particularly not during the war's most sensitive months. By dawn, Lieutenant Marjorie Hale, a former mathematics instructor turned OSS analyst, logged the anomaly as a Category Red irregularity. Her entry would mark the beginning of what later became known in Langley archives as the Ghost File. The struggle began with uncertainty. The Allies' relationship with the Soviet Union was fragile, held together by mutual necessity rather than genuine trust. Every exchange of intelligence carried political weight. A single misinterpreted message could disrupt the careful equilibrium between Washington, London, and Moscow. Hale and her colleagues in London understood the stakes well. As the German Sixth Army faltered in the east and the Soviets prepared their sweeping counteroffensives, the flow of Allied aid, from aircraft parts to radio equipment, depended on cooperation. A rogue Soviet cipher could signify internal panic. Or worse, suspicion directed at the Americans. Historical context only deepened the tension. OSS officers had long struggled to assess Soviet reliability. Diaries from U.S. military mission staff in Moscow routinely noted NKVD surveillance, restricted access to airfields, and sudden interrogations of American personnel. Colonel Fenton Burke, the mission's deputy commander, wrote in late 1942, "Nothing is casual here. Every gesture is observed. Every visitor is recorded." Against that backdrop, the unusual cipher seemed less like a mistake and more like a warning. A message not meant for Allied eyes, yet transmitted through a channel the Soviets knew the OSS monitored. As Hale and her team compared the code structure to earlier transmissions from Soviet diplomatic posts in Tehran, Ankara, and London, one finding stood out. The message's origin pointed to a relay station near Kybyshev, the provisional wartime capital of the Soviet government. That location alone raised questions. Why would a communication of such vague content originate from one of Moscow's most tightly controlled hubs? And why transmit it on a frequency occasionally swept by British listening posts? The reveal came when an older OSS intercept from December 1942 surfaced during the investigation. Buried in its text was a similar phrase, an oblique reference to the observer and the breach in the corridor. At the time, analysts dismissed it as a description of German troop movements along the Smolensk land bridge. But paired with the January cipher, it suggested continuity. A pattern of discrete references to an individual, someone likely known to both sides. Someone whose presence or actions had unsettled Soviet nerves. Someone possibly American. Hale recalled that week in a post-war interview. "It felt as if we were listening through a keyhole to a conversation not meant for us, something half hidden, half revealed." The mystery within the message pulled the team deeper. If the Soviets believed an American operative had compromised a sensitive area, it could reshape the OSS' entire presence in the East. And if the cipher was not intended for them, the implications were even more dangerous. It would mean they had intercepted a communication Moscow believed completely secure. Even in the modern era, the full meaning of the cipher remains debated among historians. Some argue it was part of a Soviet internal mole hunt. Others believe it referenced the accidental discovery of a classified Red Army position by an Allied aircraft. Whatever its true purpose, the puzzle set off a chain reaction that soon drew in Bletchley Park, the U.S. military mission, and even fragments of MI6's Far Eastern section. The part closes on the unresolved tension of those early days. With no clear answers and mounting concern in London, OSS leadership classified the document as Top Secret Ultra and created a new tracking folder. Ghost, Subject Unknown. They had no idea that within weeks, a missing US airman's name would surface, and with it, a deeper mystery that threatened to shake Allied trust at a critical moment in the war. By early February 1943, a quiet urgency settled over the intelligence rooms of both the OSS London Station and Bletchley Park. The anomalous Soviet cipher, now the centerpiece of the newly labeled Langley ghost file, had moved beyond simple curiosity. It had become a potential diplomatic fault line. The British, who had far more experience navigating the labyrinth of Soviet wartime communication, understood one thing immediately. Moscow did not make mistakes with its state cipher networks. If a message appeared irregular, it was irregular by intent. And intent, in the world of Soviet intelligence, always meant something. Bletchley's Hut 3, responsible for military intelligence analysis, took the first deep dive. They compared the structure of the intercepted code to NKVD diplomatic patterns, noting that the rhythm of its numeric sequences carried familiar echoes, yet diverged sharply in its grouping intervals. To the cryptanalysts, it was as if someone had tried to mimic Soviet cipher discipline but had chosen to reveal something between the lines. A message hiding other messages, as one analyst wrote in a marginal note. That note would later guide the next steps of the investigation. The struggle intensified when the British traced the transmission to a known Soviet relay site outside Kybyshev, one used sparingly for diplomatic traffic but consistently for NKVD communications. That alone was alarming. The NKVD, deeply suspicious of both Western and internal threats, rarely pushed anything through channels that risked Allied interception. Yet this message had been sent across a line that British listening posts in Iran and Turkey routinely swept. It felt like an intentional breadcrumb, or worse, a signal meant for someone the British and Americans were never meant to identify. Adding to the complexity was the wartime reality. The Soviets and the British were working together, but not trusting each other. Intelligence sharing functioned on a fragile unspoken rule: reveal only what is necessary to keep the alliance intact. British diarist and Foreign Office liaison Captain Douglas Selkirk summarized it bleakly in December 1942. They say we are collaborators, but the NKVD records every cigarette stub we drop. With such an atmosphere, even the hint that an American operative might have wandered into a sensitive Soviet zone risked reigniting long-standing tensions. The insight came when Bletchley analysts uncovered another anomaly. Hidden in the January cipher's scrambled numerical blocks were repeated references, subtle echoes, of an older Soviet codebook used before the German invasion in 1941. This older structure had been gradually phased out, yet here it was resurfacing, mixed with a modern diplomatic cipher. To intelligence veterans, this pattern suggested desperation. Either someone in the Soviet chain was bypassing official clearance, or a faction within the system was sending messages by means deliberately removed from current NKVD procedures. The reveal that shifted the narrative arrived on February 16, when OSS Washington cross-checked Allied records relating to personnel movements around the Eastern Front. A single name surfaced: Lieutenant Samuel Kerr, a U.S. Army Air Force's navigator attached to the shuttle bombing coordination program between the 8th Air Force and the Red Air Force. Kerr had vanished 2 months earlier after a weather-diverted liaison flight from Poltava failed to return. His aircraft, a stripped-down B-25 used for reconnaissance liaison, was last detected heading southeast, toward a region the Soviets tightly restricted due to German proximity. Nothing about Kerr's disappearance had ever aligned neatly. Soviet reports claimed his aircraft landed safely, and that the crew was returned through appropriate channels. Yet no American records confirmed Kerr's return. In fact, 2 Soviet officers listed as having assisted in the recovery had since been reassigned to far-flung posts, common practice when the NKVD wanted to reorganize a narrative. When Hale reviewed the cipher again with Kerr in mind, several phrases took on chilling new clarity. The missing one. The corridor breach. The one who saw. These fragments, previously treated as obscure, suddenly appeared deliberate. If Kerr had witnessed something, an NKVD transfer, a restricted rail junction, a mismanaged frontline position. The Soviets might have feared he carried information they preferred the Allies never learn. Yet the mystery deepened in another direction. A secondary intercept, found in a backlog of British sweeps from the Caspian Sea corridor, included a truncated Soviet message referencing the American airman, without specifying his status. Why would the Soviets acknowledge his existence in one intercept but suppress all trace of him in official communication? The contradiction smelled of internal Soviet conflict, either between military branches or between local commanders and NKVD watchdogs. The application for modern viewers is stark. Wartime alliances, no matter how united against a common enemy, often rested on layers of secrecy, mistrust, and concealed agendas. Decisions affecting the lives of individual servicemen could be swallowed whole by geopolitical necessity. As February closed, the Americans and British faced a dilemma. To confront the Soviets risked destabilizing cooperation on Lend-Lease logistics and shuttle mission frantic operations. To remain silent meant potentially abandoning an American officer and ignoring an unexplained cipher that hinted at wrongdoing. In the end, they chose a cautious approach. A small liaison team from the U.S. military mission in Moscow quietly initiated inquiries. But what they encountered upon arrival would heighten the mystery, not solve it. And behind all of it, the cipher remained only partially broken, its deeper meaning still concealed beneath layers the Allies had yet to penetrate. The ghost file was only beginning. The arrival of the OSS liaison team in Moscow on March 3, 1943, was met with the kind of orchestrated silence that had become a signature of Soviet wartime bureaucracy. The team, 3 officers led by Major Richard Holden, had been authorized under the formal purpose of logistical coordination. But their true mission, written only in a folded orders packet carried inside Holden's overcoat, was to determine whether the Soviets were holding an American airman whose name appeared to echo through an unsolved cipher. It was a task that had to be handled without offense, without accusation, and above all, without giving the impression that the Allies mistrusted their Soviet partners, a contradiction that defined the era's uneasy diplomacy. Their hook into the mystery began almost immediately. On their first day, the group was escorted to the U.S. military mission compound on Covert Street, a former noble residence across from the Kremlin. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The mission's deputy head, Colonel Fenton Burke, an American officer seasoned by years of navigating Soviet suspicion, met them with a blunt warning. "Whatever you ask, they've already decided how they'll answer." Burke's diary later recorded the encounter with clipped frustration. "There is something here," he wrote. "Something everyone sees but pretends not to." The struggle intensified as Holden's team began their rounds of carefully negotiated meetings with Soviet officers. These sessions took place in conference rooms where portraits of Stalin loomed above long lacquered tables. Their hosts spoke politely but evasively. When Holden asked about downed Allied aircraft, one Red Air Force colonel replied, "None lost in that sector," though American logs unmistakably listed Kurs B-25 as missing near those coordinates. The contradictions multiplied. The Soviets insisted they had returned all recovered Allied crewmen, promptly through official channels. Yet the Americans had no record of Kurs' return, and 2 Soviet liaison officers who supposedly escorted him to safety had been transferred to unknown destinations. The insight that began to reshape the investigation came from an unexpected source. An unclassified Red Army bulletin displayed at a Moscow airfield. Holden noticed dates and recovery locations that didn't align with official logs. One entry described a forced landing near Bryansk in December 1942, a location that matched early reports of Kurs B-25 before Soviet documents altered the timeline. A junior Soviet mechanic quietly remarked that a crew recovered in that area had been taken by the Blue Caps, using slang for the NKVD's blue-piped uniforms. It was the first unofficial acknowledgement that Kerr might have been detained rather than rescued. Holden documented the clue in an encrypted cable to OSS London. Possible NKVD involvement. Further confirmation unlikely through formal channels. It was a significant moment, an admission that the mystery hinted at internal Soviet security actions rather than battlefield misfortune. The reveal deepened 2 days later when the team visited Moscow's Air Force Archive Annex to request flight logs. A clerk, nervous and glancing repeatedly toward a supervising officer, produced a partial logbook from the Soviet 4th Air Army. The pages included entries referencing foreign crew recovery, but dates had been overwritten, and entire lines were redacted with thick strokes of black ink. Holden requested copies. The clerk hesitated, then replied in a tone bordering on apology. These were altered by another office before arrival. The supervising officer stepped closer, ending the discussion with a single phrase: "This material is not subject to foreign review." Still, in the space of that tense exchange, Holden caught sight of a name written on one partially covered entry, Kerr, before the log was snapped shut and taken away. It was proof the Soviets had documented him. Proof they had never shared. To understand why, the OSS team studied Soviet political behavior along the front. The NKVD's restrictive policies near Smolensk and Bryansk were well known. These were zones rife with partisan activity, German infiltration, and high-value rail junctions feeding army group centers' supply lines. Photographs or observations made by a wandering foreign officer, even unintentionally, might have violated Soviet security measures. The Soviets, often reacting harshly to perceived breaches, were known to detain witnesses until information could be contained. Such detentions rarely appeared in official archives. A modern viewer might interpret this as an inevitable clash of cultures. The US and UK, accustomed to transparency within their alliance, versus the Soviet system, where secrecy was survival. For Moscow, even allies were potential intelligence risks. And in 1943, with the Red Army finally turning the tide against the Germans, paranoia was at its peak. The part closes on a rising sense of danger. On their final night in Moscow, Holden received an unmarked envelope slid beneath his door. Inside was a single sentence written in Russian: "Ask no more of the one who saw." No signature. No explanation. But the phrasing matched the mysterious Soviet cipher that had started the entire investigation. Shaken, Holden's team prepared to leave Moscow the next morning. They had found fragments, hints of Soviet detainment, distorted records, and unspoken fear, but no confirmation. And yet the evidence was now too substantial to dismiss. The next phase of the investigation would push the Americans and British deeper into Kerr's trail, from Soviet archives to the contested forests and villages of the Eastern Front, where fading memories and scattered clues awaited, along with a mystery that seemed to grow darker the further they pursued it. The forests and ravaged farmlands stretching between Smolensk and Bryansk bore the scars of 2 years of uninterrupted war. It was here, in this contested corridor of the Eastern Front, that Lieutenant Samuel Kerr's trail began to re-emerge. For the OSS and the British teams following the faint threads left behind, the region carried a distinct weight. Villages had been burned and rebuilt multiple times. Front lines had shifted like tides, and the NKVD's presence remained as rigid and omnipresent as the German patrols that once stalked the same roads. If Kerr had indeed been detained, or worse, this was the ground where answers might exist, buried beneath layers of Soviet red tape and wartime devastation. The hook emerged on their second day in the region, a formerly classified Soviet Air Army memo recovered by a British liaison officer. The memo referenced a restricted aerial incident involving a foreign aircraft observed photographing a rail junction near Roslevel in December 1942. This detail matched the logbook entries that Major Holden had glimpsed in Moscow, evidence that Kerr had flown over an area known for its strategic significance. The Roslevel rail complex was a crucial node for both Soviet and German supply lines in earlier phases of the war. Even Allied reconnaissance, if unsanctioned or misinterpreted, could have triggered NKVD intervention. That memo would become the guiding thread for the investigation. The struggle lay not only in locating evidence but in navigating Soviet hostility and the natural decay of wartime memory. The Soviet commander assigned to escort the OSS British team, Captain Alexei Turgenev, maintained strict control over their movements. Every conversation with local civilians required his presence. Every request for access needed signatures from multiple offices. War leaves only 2 kinds of traces here, he warned. Those that have been ordered preserved, and those that have been ordered erased. His tone made it clear which kind they were searching for. Still, fragments surfaced. In a small village outside Yelnya, the team spoke with an elderly collective farmer who recalled seeing a twin-engine aircraft flying low, trailing smoke in the winter of 1942. He remembered Red Army trucks arriving shortly after, along with men in blue caps who warned villagers to stay inside. The description matched Soviet rescue protocols, but the mention of blue-piped NKVD caps suggested the event was considered more than a routine aircraft recovery. His comment, delivered quietly as Turgenev pretended to check his map, carried the weight of lived experience. "Strangers," he muttered, "only appear when something important has happened." The insight deepened when the team reached a requisitioned schoolhouse serving as a forward archive for the Soviet Fourth Air Army. After 2 days of negotiations, and a promise to limit their examination to non-sensitive materials, they were allowed to inspect recovered aircraft debris. Among the items catalogued as American origin, Holden discovered an aluminum panel fragment stamped with a partial serial matching Kurs B-25. Yet the archive's inventory placed the debris 40 kilometers east of the documented crash coordinates. When Holden pointed out the discrepancy, the archivist stiffened and referred to logistical errors in chaotic conditions. It was a phrase Holden had already heard too many times from Soviet officials. But the reveal came in the form of a fracture in the Soviet facade, an unexpected moment of candor. Outside the archive, a junior Soviet lieutenant approached Sergeant William Pierce, the OSS team's Russian-speaking NCO. The lieutenant asked quietly, "The American you seek, the one who saw something?" Shocked, Pierce nodded cautiously. The officer hesitated, scanning for superiors, then whispered, "Some records are not meant for foreigners. Or for soldiers. Or sometimes even for truth." Before Pierce could ask more, the officer walked away, disappearing into a line of trucks. This cryptic comment confirmed what the investigators had suspected. Kerr had likely encountered a restricted Soviet installation or movement. The rail junction near Roslevel, possibly involving a transfer of prisoners, munitions, or even political detainees, could have been the catalyst. The Soviets were known to use remote rail networks for NKVD prisoner transports and intelligence transfers, activities they shielded fiercely, even from allies. A modern reflection underscores the reality. Allied and Soviet intelligence cooperation during World War II was never seamless. Both sides balanced the need for coordination against fears of espionage, misunderstanding, or internal exposure. In such a climate, a foreign airman landing near a sensitive Soviet operation, even accidentally, could be perceived as a threat requiring containment. The final clues of this stage appeared at a partisan encampment in the Bryansk forests. The British had long established channels with Soviet-aligned partisans, viewing them as more willing to speak freely than regular Red Army officers. One aging partisan remembered an American being brought through their camp, confused, injured, and watched over by men who did not wear army badges. That vague but chilling description suggested NKVD custodianship. Asked what happened next, the partisan only shrugged. "They took him east. We never saw him again." The close of Part 4 lands with mounting uncertainty. The more evidence the team uncovered, the more carefully orchestrated the Soviet concealment appeared. Every trail pointed somewhere, but no trail was allowed to lead far enough. Holden's final entry from this phase of the investigation captured the atmosphere perfectly. "We are circling a disappearance. Not a crash, not a rescue. A disappearance crafted by design. And every answer we draw close to vanishes behind another closed Soviet door." Ahead lay the most sensitive stage, cross-examining Soviet officers and reconstructing the secret transfer east, hinted in the Cipher. And with each step, the mystery of Kerr's fate only deepened. The spring of 1943 brought shifting lines and rising hopes across the Eastern Front, yet for the Allied investigators navigating Soviet bureaucracy, the path only grew more convoluted. Every clue they uncovered about Lieutenant Samuel Kerr seemed to trigger another vanishing point. Officers reassigned, witnesses relocated, documents redacted beyond recognition. It was as if the story itself resisted being found. What drove the mystery deeper was not just the lack of information, but the unmistakable signs of information being deliberately reshaped. This was the Soviet system at work. Precise, opaque, and unyielding. The hook emerged from a set of decrypted fragments, additional remnants of the anomalous Soviet Cipher first intercepted months earlier. As the OSS and Bletchley teams continued to re-examine the data, a new pattern emerged. The phrase, "transfer east," repeated twice within different numeric clusters. To Western intelligence interpreters, the term carried chilling implications. Transfer east was a euphemism documented in scattered NKVD records, often associated with prisoner relocation to remote facilities beyond the Urals. It was never used for rescued Allied personnel. This detail reframed every assumption the investigators had made so far. The struggle now centered on reconstructing the events following Kerr's possible detainment. To do that, Holden and the Anglo-American team turned to the Red Army's frontline detachments, units known for keeping informal, handwritten logs that escaped NKVD editing. They began interviewing officers from the 33rd Guards Rifle Division, which had operated near Roslavel at the time of Kerr's disappearance. Many soldiers remembered seeing Allied aircraft overhead. One recalled a small B-25 landing, hard but intact, in an open field. But what followed remained vague. "NKVD trucks came," a survivor said. "They told us nothing." For these men, secrecy was not questioned. It was simply accepted as part of wartime life. An insight came from an unexpected quarter, a captured German report stored in the British files at Kuibyshev. Dated December 1942, it referenced an American aircraft forced down behind Soviet lines, noting unusual Soviet movement in response. German reconnaissance had observed escort vehicles heading toward the crash site, vehicles consistent with NKVD operations rather than standard Red Army recovery teams. It was rare for German intelligence to distinguish between the two, lending credibility to their observation. Holden wrote in his evaluation, "Even the enemy could see the distinction. And yet our allies refused to acknowledge the event." The reveal that shook the investigation arrived when the OSS team gained access to a small command hut near Roslavel used by Soviet logistics officers. In a dusty drawer filled with requisition forms, they found a torn page from an NKVD transfer ledger, its official classification stamp removed. On it were several entries listing detainees moved through rail spurs near the town. Most were marked as political suspects or deserters. But under the December listings was a single line marked only "Foreign, Unlisted," escorted by second section. No name. No nationality. Just a category. One reserved for individuals whose identities were intentionally obscured. The date matched the time frame of Kerr's disappearance. When Holden presented the page to Captain Turgenev, their Soviet escort stiffened. "This is not authorized material," he said, reaching for the paper. Holden refused to hand it over. Turgenev's jaw tightened, but after a long silence he muttered, "You will not find the person you seek in our records. That is the truth I can tell you." His expression suggested another truth remained unspoken. Modern analysts might interpret this as a product of wartime paranoia. The Soviet Union, fighting for survival and scarred by internal purges, protected its secrets with unmatched intensity. Foreigners, even allies, were filtered through the lens of suspicion. To Soviet intelligence officers, the presence of an American near classified rail traffic would have been an intolerable breach. The NKVD acted not out of malice toward the Allies, but out of rigid adherence to internal security doctrine. The team's path forward led them to a remote depot east of Bryansk, where the rail line curved into dense woodland. Here, partisan accounts had first mentioned an American being moved under guard. The depot's Soviet administrator, a thin, hollow-cheeked man with the posture of someone long accustomed to answering carefully, admitted that transfers occurred there frequently. When shown Kerr's photograph, he did not deny seeing him, but simply looked away. "Many passed through," he said quietly. "Some did not pass back." The close of Part 5 comes with a pivotal moment. On their final day at the depot, Sergeant Pierce found an abandoned manifest stub wedged beneath a crate. It listed a convoy departing December 19, 1942, headed toward a facility near Gorky. The escorting unit was labeled Section 4, Special Transport. The notation matched those used for NKVD prisoner convoys. At the bottom of the stub, barely legible, was a faint pencil marking, "Foreign flyer." No rank. No identification. The team now possessed more evidence than ever before, and yet still no certainty. The phrase from the cipher, "transfer east," suddenly felt painfully literal. Kerr had not simply been lost, he had been moved. And if the Soviets had transferred him, the next question was the one they feared most: to where? By the time spring gave way to the heavy rains of early 1945, the Langley ghost file had grown into a thick, uneven collection of cipher fragments, half-redacted reports, contradictory Soviet statements, and the fading testimonies of soldiers who had simply seen too much war to recall every detail clearly. Yet despite months of painstaking work, the Allied investigators found themselves trapped in a tightening circle. The more they uncovered about Lieutenant Samuel Kerr's disappearance, the more the Soviet narrative retreated behind layers of state secrecy. The case had evolved from a tactical inquiry into a political liability, one no side wanted to bring into the light. But even as the war neared its final stages, new evidence still emerged, each piece adding both clarity and haunting uncertainty. The hook came from an unexpected source, a recently liberated region near Gorky, where captured German intelligence papers were being catalogued. Among them was a field report from Abwehr Section 3 noting the movement of an NKVD-controlled prisoner convoy in late December 1942, precisely when Kerr would have been in Soviet custody if the earlier evidence was correct. The report described an unusual foreign detainee, whose arrival at the convoy had prompted enhanced security. Although the Germans could not identify the man, their note echoed the vocabulary used in the Soviet cipher, "the one who saw." This external confirmation, fragmentary as it was, sent a cold shock through the OSS team. Even their enemy had glimpsed the edges of the mystery. The struggle intensified as OSS and British analysts tried to reconstruct the convoy's final destination. Convoy manifests were notoriously incomplete, deliberately obscured, or destroyed as part of NKVD protocols. Some followed clear paths to labor camps or interrogation centers. Others diverted into administrative dead ends, files swallowed by an ever-expanding Soviet security apparatus. The possibility that Kerr had been absorbed into such a system, even temporarily, posed a diplomatic nightmare. If confirmed, it would suggest that the Soviet Union had detained an American officer without notification, violating wartime cooperation agreements. Historical insight emerged when Bletchley Park crypt analysts noticed a curious pattern in post-war Soviet diplomatic traffic. Certain code groups, unused since early 1943, resurfaced briefly in January 1945. When cross-referenced with the older cipher tied to the ghost file, analysts realized these new transmissions repeated structural quirks from the original anomaly. One senior crypt analyst hypothesized that a clerk or department still referenced an outdated template associated with sensitive internal incidents, including those involving foreigners. While not direct evidence, the parallel hinted that the Kerr case had not been forgotten inside Soviet bureaucracy, even 2 years later. Files that lingered in that system rarely did so by accident. The reveal of the investigation's final phase arrived when a Soviet officer, speaking under conditions designed to protect him from NKVD retaliation, shared a critical detail with the British. He claimed that in late 1942, before the Red Army recaptured the Bryansk region, the NKVD had briefly detained an American aviator who had been found near a restricted railway junction where classified troop transfers were occurring. According to this officer, the foreigner was not mistreated but questioned intensely, and afterward placed on a transport east to a facility where foreign detainees were sometimes held pending clarification. The officer believed the man had been released or transferred again, but he knew nothing of the final outcome. His account aligned uncannily with the fragments uncovered throughout the inquiry. Yet even with this testimony, a complete answer resisted forming. The NKVD had operated numerous temporary, special camps during the winter of 1942-43. Makeshift sites often dissolved within weeks. Records from such facilities were notoriously sparse, sometimes reduced to pencil notations on scraps of paper. Many were destroyed before retreating German forces could capture them. Kerr might have passed through one of these transient locations, only for the paper trail to vanish as Soviet units reorganized. A modern reflection emerges from this final stage of the investigation. Wartime alliances, however essential, do not eliminate deeply embedded systems of secrecy. The Americans and British sought transparency. The Soviets valued control. The tension between these worldviews became painfully apparent in cases like Kerr's. For the Red Army and NKVD, safeguarding internal operations outweighed diplomatic clarity, even with allies. For the Americans, the idea of an airman disappearing within an ally's territory was unthinkable. The close of the Ghost Files wartime chapter came quietly. In February 1945, with the Yalta Conference underway and the fate of post-war Europe being negotiated, the OSS leadership made a decision. The Kerr investigation, officially labeled inconclusive, was to be archived under restricted classification, pending possible future review. It was not a cover-up, but a recognition of political reality. Raising accusations against Moscow during the fragile transition from war to peace would jeopardize cooperation at the highest level. And without definitive proof, without a body, a document, or a witness willing to speak openly, the case could not move forward. In the dim light of an OSS storage room in London, Holden signed the final wartime entry. "The trail ends here," he wrote. "Not because the truth is unreachable, but because the truth is protected by a system designed to outlast the war." His last line, scrawled in the margin, captured the lingering unease. "We never cracked the cipher. It cracked us." The Langley ghost file would remain dormant for decades, an unresolved wartime enigma, a testament to the shadows cast by uneasy alliances, and a reminder that even in a global conflict defined by clarity of enemies, some stories slipped into the gray, never to fully re-emerge.